Hi there, I'm Deborah Bonello, Managing Editor for Insight Crime, and I'm joined today by our co-director, Jeremy McDermott. Jerry, we're diving into Venezuela today, which has been in the news constantly in recent months following an increased military presence, as well as missile attacks on suspected drug trafficking boats in the Caribbean. Now, talk in Washington has turned to toppling President Nicolas Maduro under the guise, at least, of anti-narcotics operations. Now, we've been investigating organised crime in Venezuela since we launched as an organisation 15 years ago. And you, Jerry, have been in and out of the country for the last 25 years. So let's start with the big picture. Now, how stable is the Maduro regime right now? And why should we, who look at organised crime, care? And how is the regime reacting to the fighting talk from the US?
I've got to fess up immediately, Deborah, as I never thought Nicolas Maduro would survive this long. And you may remember there was the month of 2015, and my money was on him going down during these mass protests when Caracas was paralyzed. There were tens of thousands of people in the streets. He survived that. He not only survived that, he survived international sanctions. He survived international isolation. He survived a collapsed economy. And he essentially presides over a largely failing state in the sense that the health service doesn't work, education doesn't work. The average wage of a Venezuelan government employee is between $10 and $30 a month, paid in worthless bolivars. So, with all of this context, I don't write him off. The other thing is that it's not just Nicolas Maduro. It is the group around him. It's Diosdado Cabello. It's all the senior Chavista political figures. And it's the high command of the military. And, it's a quasi-praetorian regime, if you want to understand Venezuela. It's a fusion of the Chavista party, the communist, the socialist party of Venezuela, and the military. That is essentially the regime. And that appears to be rock solid. Now, the US put $50 million now on the head of Nicolas Maduro. This is more than Osama bin Laden had. The reason for this, we analyze, is an attempt to fragment or divide some of the Maduro regime. However, the US has also indicted almost everybody else at the top of the regime, if not for drug trafficking, then human rights abuses. So if Maduro goes, they all go. And this is why I think, as Venezuela becomes a fully recognized dictatorship after the stolen elections last year, we need to look at this through a different optic. And as a dictatorial regime, the Maduro regime looks pretty strong at the moment.
Okay, so let's take a leap and let's look at some what ifs. If Maduro does fall, what comes next?
Okay, the big what if. There are, option number one, is there a peaceful transfer of power to Edmundo González, who actually won last year's presidential elections, according to the returns from the machines, who is the front for Maria Corina Machado, who is the driving force, the Iron Lady of Venezuelan politics. So that would be the rosy option number one. Option number two would be, well, hang on, the Chavistas control every lever of power. And so there is an agreement between the Chavistas and the opposition to share power. And somehow that is negotiated without bloodshed and without rancor. Option number two. Option number three, Maduro falls and there's just simply a recomposition of this regime, this fusion between the Socialist Party and the military, and another hard man, climbs to the top of that particular pile.
So talk to me about the criminal elements, because we have this sort of deeply entrenched regime, but around them are lots of different armed groups. Like, what would be the implications for them if Maduro did leave power and there was a sort of recalibration at the top?
Okay, let's first of all just explain how the hybrid criminal regime that Maduro has created works, because to understand this, we have to understand what might change. Maduro is not the head of the Cartel of the Suns and vertically integrated drug trafficking organization as presented by the United States. He's just created this environment whereby this regime, the regime figures, are in bed with different criminal elements. It's the drug trade, it's the gold trade, it's the illegal smuggling of oil to move sanctions. I mean, this is a criminalized regime, forced to become increasingly criminal, one by the fall in its main export of oil, but secondly, the fact that they can't sell it openly now on international markets. And so this has forced Maduro to get into bed to get access with the criminal rents. So if he goes, would this structure suddenly collapse? And would suddenly the checks and balances of a healthy democracy and transparency suddenly appear, whereby criminal elements wouldn't be able to operate?
Mm-hmm.
I think you know what I'm going to say to that particular possibility. The answer is absolutely not. You have to remember that the Chavista regime has been in power almost 25 years. Mm-hmm. They have dismantled every check and balance. They control every organ of government. And most importantly, they control the military, and the forces of repression are extremely politicized. So even if Edmundo González is handed the keys to Miraflores, the presidential palace, is he going to be able to govern from it?
Let's talk our audience through a little bit the criminal groups that are surrounding the regime, because we have the homebred armed groups that have both favored and blighted the regime, and then you have Colombian criminal groups in Venezuela. So run us through a little bit of that, and whether you think that we could see Venezuela, should the regime change, descend into a civil conflict similar to what we've seen in Colombia over the last 4 decades.
Yeah, even longer. No, this is the phantom that hangs over all of this. Now, most of the criminal groups in Venezuela operate in alliance with some element of the state, be it the military, be it the police, be it the Attorney General's office, be it the senior political figures. And the shock troops, the Venezuelan shock troops, so these are the so-called colectivos. These were community groups, initially called the Bolivarian Circles under Hugo Chavez, that you may remember played a huge role when there was a coup against Hugo Chavez by the military. It was the colectivos that defended the president and helped him regain power. But all of these criminal groups have greater or lesser relationships with members of the regime. So if there's a regime change and all these contacts disappear, what happens? Now, what we know, studying for the last 15 years organized crime in the region, is the criminals don't pack their bags and go, oh, okay, we'll just go home and we'll get a real job. Mm-hmm. No, what they do is they adapt. They adapt quickly to changing conditions, way quicker than any state force. Add to that Venezuelan criminal mix the groups you've mentioned, the Colombian groups, principally the National Liberation Army, the ELN. This is a group born in Cuba in 1964, Deb. They still look like Che Guevara. They still wear the berets. They've still got the beards, and the stars. These guys are in this sort of time warp of a Marxist-Leninist revolution years after the Iron Curtain came down and the Cold War finished. But of course, ideologically, they see themselves as perfectly aligned with the Bolivarian revolution of Hugo Chavez. So this is this pro-regime paramilitary force in Venezuela that Maduro has used to help him win elections, to suppress opposition, NGOs he doesn't like, etc., etc. This is a group that survived 6 decades of war with the Colombian state, and the last 20 years of those supported by the United States. Mm-hmm. I mean, the US has pumped billions of dollars into Colombia. And ostensibly in the name of the war on drugs, which hasn't been successful. But after 9/11, this essentially became a war against terrorism as well, because these rebel groups, the FARC and the ELN, were all on the US terrorism list. And in that sense, they were partially successful because it forced the demobilization of the FARC. They used to be the principal group in Venezuela, and they're still there. Dissidents are still there, but now the biggest group by far, 6,000 strong, is the ELN. They're really well trained. They're really well armed. They have got 60 years nigh on of combat experience. And so this is not a force that you can take on with any ease. Colombia hasn't been able to take on with much ease, backed by the US. And Venezuela, which is in bed with the ELN, should there be a change in government tomorrow, how do you take on a group that has quasi-legitimate status all along the Colombo-Venezuelan border and several other parts of the country? So what might change, if there is regime change, is the ELN and the dissidents would turn from pro-regime paramilitaries to insurgent guerrillas in Venezuela as well as Colombia. And suddenly a new Venezuelan government has got to take on thousands of not just Colombians, but Venezuelans that have been recruited into the ELN, firmly established on its national territory, using an army that's been in bed with the ELN for many years now.
Yeah, I mean, if we've seen anything in organized crime in the region, it's their ability to adapt and survive. And I don't think the ELN is any different. And Maduro, as you said, is a surprise survivor. And the other survivor, I think, in all of this is likely to be the international cocaine business, which we know is kind of financing from behind the scenes, albeit a lot of the criminal groups that are in Venezuela, as well as the regime itself to a certain extent. You know, and the sort of saber rattling around what's happening between Venezuela and the US has ostensibly been coated in anti-narcotics strategy, right? So to finish, Jerry, what do you think would be the impact on the international cocaine business if we did see the Maduro regime fall?
Okay. To set the scene quickly, Colombia is producing more cocaine than ever in its history. Okay, you know, the increase has been extraordinary. So we've got a vast supply, which actually has outpaced demand for a bit, although that's beginning to change as the drug trafficking organizations exploit new markets. Initially, it was the United States was the principal market, then Western Europe, and now we're seeing Central and Eastern Europe getting folded into the same European dynamics. We're seeing Asia, Australia, all cocaine seizures are turning up everywhere. And this is the exploitation of new markets. So how does Venezuela fit into all of this? One, it's right next to one of Colombia's biggest coca producing regions called Catatumbo, literally smack on the border. Two, it provides a natural transit to much of the Caribbean, to any departure points towards West Africa, and transit to ports in, or departure points in Suriname, Guyana, French Guyana, and northern Brazil. So if you get cocaine into Venezuela, there are loads of different ways you can spit it out of the country, be it going for Europe, be it for the United States, be it for Asia, okay? Most of the departure points are not in Venezuela, because Venezuela doesn't export anything apart from oil. So it's got to go somewhere else before it contaminates a container, for example. Although there are semi-submersibles being built in Venezuela now, they're going across the Atlantic. There's plenty of cargo ships that get contaminated in Venezuelan waters. And then, of course, although not at the moment, there are the go-fast boats that before were streaking across, but now you're going to attract a Hellfire missile, so probably not that many of them at the moment. What would be the effect then, Deb, if Venezuelan criminal dynamics change? We've looked at different options. None of the options we've discussed really are going to raise the level of resilience to cocaine trafficking through Venezuela in the short term.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
So what might happen is what's happened now with the US flotilla off the coast of the north coast of Venezuela. It might interrupt some of the routes. It might interrupt some of the players who are state players. And assuming there's a regime change and these state players are no longer in the state, there's going to be a repositioning, reaccommodation of the criminal scene. And as we both know, that's going to happen very quickly. Mm-hmm. And the different links in the cocaine chain will reaccommodate very quickly. Because the days of the cartels are gone, Deb. As we know, if you want to move drugs anywhere, usually there'll be 3 different nationalities in the room. Mm-hmm. There'll be the owner of the shipment, there'll be the transporter for that particular leg, and there'll be the buyer, and so on, all the way through. So it's like a constellation now of different criminal groups working in tandem, subcontracted, et cetera, et cetera. Only a small part of that constellation sits in Venezuela. It's been an increasingly important part with the increase of cocaine being produced right on the border, but it's by no means a foundational part that if you remove it, even assuming it would be removed, would suddenly kick the drug trade in the teeth and stop, let alone seriously interrupt the flow of cocaine across the globe.
Yeah, I mean, it will be really interesting to see if we ever get to that point. And I suspect, Jerry, that this is probably not going to be the last time that we talk about what's going on between Venezuela and the United States. But thanks for helping us unpack it a little bit. And thanks for watching out there. Please go to insightcrime.org to learn more about all of the criminal dynamics in the region, the criminal groups that we've been talking about, as well as the international cocaine business. Bye-bye for now.